They laughed at him. One man alone, standing in a room full of legal giants, daring to take on a multimillionaire. They called him a fool, unprepared, an amateur. But when he revealed the truth, when he unmasked his lies, everyone fell silent. Because at that moment, they knew that he had already won. Keanu Reeves never planned to become a lawyer. He was just a man protecting what was his. His land, his legacy had been stolen by one of the wealthiest developers in town. And since no one was willing to fight for him, he decided to fight for himself. What happened next exceeded anyone's expectations. A trial that started as a lost cause turned into a court battle that shocked the entire legal world. This is the story of how an ordinary man brought down a corrupt empire. It all started with a phone call. Keanu was sitting on the porch of his home, sipping a cup of black coffee and enjoying the balmy morning air. The land stretched out before him, golden fields gently swaying in the breeze. It was the kind of morning that reminded him why he had never left this place, why his family had kept it for generations. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Ben Parker, his closest neighbor and longtime friend. How strange. Ben wasn't the kind of guy who called unless something was wrong. Keanu answered. Ben, you need to get over here, right now. His voice was sharp, urgent. Keanu sat up straight. What's going on? Come here, quickly. A cold weight settled in Keanu's stomach. He put down his coffee, grabbed his keys, and climbed into his old truck. Gravel crunched under the tires as he made his way down the dirt road, his heart hammering in his chest. When he reached the western boundary of his property, he slammed on the brakes so hard that the truck came to a stop. And then he saw it. Bulldozers, construction equipment. His land was crowded with workers in hard hats and neon vests, whose heavy machinery was already turning the soil. Tall metal poles marked the future plots. Surveyors scoured the land, scribbling notes. And in the middle of it all, like a slap in the face, loomed a huge white sign with bold black lettering, Future Site of Madsen Luxury Estates. Keanu's breath caught. His land, the land his grandfather had spent a lifetime protecting, was being torn apart before his eyes, and no one had told him. He flung open the truck door and jumped out, rage flooding his veins. Hey, stop! The workers barely reacted. A few shot him a glance before returning to their tasks. Indifferent. Keanu turned angrily toward a man in a white hard hat, standing next to a bulldozer. What the hell do you think you're doing? The man barely glanced at him. Boss's orders, we have permits. Permits? Keanu's voice sharpened. This is my land. The man finally looked him in the eye. He smiled. Not anymore. Keanu's fists clenched at his sides. His whole body burned with rage, but he forced himself to remain calm. There had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. He ignored the workers' shouts and advanced past them toward a makeshift office trailer parked near the construction site. Inside, a smartly dressed man sat behind a cluttered desk, typing lazily on a laptop. He barely looked up when Keanu burst in. He's trespassing, Keanu growled. The man sighed, rubbing his temples as if Keanu was nothing more than another inconvenience in his day. Mr. Reeves, I presume? Keanu didn't answer. The man reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick folder, sliding it across the desk. Gerald Madsen acquired the development rights, all legal. Keanu's stomach churned as he picked up the folder and flipped through the pages, and then his blood ran cold. There on the contract was his own name, a signature at the bottom, a signature that was supposed to be his. But he had never signed it. Keanu's hands tightened around the papers. He breathed faster, harder. This is fake. The project manager shrugged, completely nonchalant. Take it to court. Keanu slammed the folder down on the desk so hard that the pen scattered. His voice was ice cold. I will. Then he turned and walked out, his heart thudding in his chest as he watched the machines tear his family's land apart. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The next morning, Keanu wasted no time. He drove into town, determined to find a lawyer who would take his case. He had proof, the forged signature, the sudden transfer of land, the construction crews setting up shop as if they were the owners. It should have been an easy case. But as soon as he walked into the first law firm, he got the same response. Sorry, we're full. I'd love to help, but this is not my area of expertise. Too complicated. I'm afraid I have to decline. At first, Keanu thought it was bad luck, but after the fourth, fifth, and sixth attorneys turned him down, he began to realize the truth. No one would take the case because no one wanted to go up against Gerald Madsen. Madsen wasn't just a real estate developer. He was a kingpin, a man with deep pockets, powerful friends, and a legal army that had crushed every lawsuit that had come his way. One lawyer finally leveled with him. Listen, the man said, leaning over his mahogany desk. Madsen has won every case he's been involved in. He has contacts with city officials, judges, and even law enforcement. You go against him? You're walking into a slaughterhouse. Keanu felt the walls closing in. If he didn't fight back, he would lose everything. But what chance did he have against someone with infinite resources in an army of lawyers? And then it hit him, like a bolt of lightning. If no lawyer would take the case, then he would. He would fight alone. As soon as Keanu announced that he was representing himself, the jeers began. People shook their heads, laughed behind his back. A rancher taking on a billionaire? A man with zero legal experience trying to fight in court? It will be chewed up and spit out. Defense attorney Richard Calloway laughed when he learned that Keanu was representing himself. This will be over in a day, he told reporters. Judge Wallace Bridger smirked as Keanu entered the courtroom, dressed in a plain suit, carrying a stack of documents he had studied night after night. Everyone thought this was over, that Madsen had already won. But Keanu didn't care. He had something Madsen didn't, the truth, and he was about to make sure everyone knew it. From the moment Keanu entered the courtroom, he felt the weight of all eyes on him. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back rows, whispering among themselves as they prepared to document what they thought would be a guaranteed defeat. Spectators whispered among themselves, some looking at Keanu with pity, others with amusement. The tension was suffocating, but Keanu kept his shoulders erect and his face indecipherable. Judge Wallace Bridger sat on the bench, glasses lowered on his nose, as he studied Keanu. The judge exhaled and tapped the gavel lightly before speaking. Mr. Reeves, do you understand that you represent yourself in this matter? There was a subtle tinge of condescension in his voice, the kind that indicated he had already gotten the idea of how this would go. Keanu stood his ground. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice firm. A muffled chuckle echoed through the room. Keanu didn't flinch, but he could hear them. The sarcastic comments, the disbelief, the silent mockery. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney, Richard Calloway, a man so sure of his own brilliance that he barely glanced at his notes, leaned back in his chair, smiling contentedly. To him, this was not a trial, it was a representation, a formal proceeding before his client, Gerald Madsen, walked out of there intact, victorious, and smug. Keanu ignored the murmurs and stares that watched him as if he was already defeated. He had spent months preparing for this, all the nights reading legal books, all the hours studying cases, all the documents he had painstakingly gathered. It had all led him to this moment. He wasn't here to play defense. He was here to win. Calloway was the first to stand, adjusting his designer suit as he stood in front of the jury. His presence commanded attention. Everything about him, his polished voice, his calculated movements, was designed to drown the jury in legalese and make them feel Keanu didn't belong here. Ladies and gentlemen, Calloway began, his voice dripping with false courtesy, I understand that Mr. Reeves has strong feelings about this case, and while I commend him for his passion, the law, unfortunately, does not work with emotions. He took slow, deliberate steps as he addressed the jury. Mr. Reeves' claim, while heartfelt, is simply a misunderstanding of property law, he continued, pausing long enough for the words to sink in. Our client, Mr. Madsen, legally acquired development rights. The necessary contracts were reviewed, approved, and filed in accordance with the regulations. What we have here, Your Honor, is not a case of fraud. It's a case of misplaced frustration. Calloway turned to Keanu, that smirk still plastered on his face. And while we respect Mr. Reeves' dedication to this case, the law is clear. His accusations are without merit. The jury nodded, already caught in the web of Calloway's carefully crafted narrative. The judge seemed satisfied. Calloway returned to his seat, confident that he had already won. Now it was Keanu's turn. He took a deep breath. It was time. He rose slowly, decisively, his boots clicking against the polished floor as he approached the jury. He could sense Calloway's amusement, Madsen's smugness, in the judge's skepticism. None of it mattered, and Keanu spoke, his voice calm but unwavering. My land has been in my family for 3 generations. He paused, letting those words sink in. And then one day, without warning, it was stolen from me. Not because I sold it, not because I lost it, but because someone forged my signature and counted on the fact that I was too small, too weak to defend myself. He turned to the jury, looking them in the eye. This is not about contracts. This is about corruption. Calloway's chair creaked as he rose. Objection, he barked. Your Honor, speculation. Judge Bridger raised a hand. Overruled. I'll allow it for now. A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. Keanu nodded and picked up the first document. This, he said, showing the deed, is my official, government-approved proof of ownership. He approached the jury and handed out copies. It clearly states the legal boundaries of my land. boundaries that Madsen ignored when he started construction. Calloway smiled in satisfaction. "Your Honor, this is obsolete paperwork," he said blandly, barely trying to hide his boredom. If Mr. Reeves had done his research, he would know that land transfers are subject to— "I did research," Keanu interrupted. Calloway's smile flickered. Keanu held up another document. "This is a certified cadastral survey from just 3 months ago." He walked over to the jury and placed it in front of them. "It confirms that Madsen's buildings extend hundreds of feet into my property." A murmur rippled through the room. The jury bowed. Judge Bridger sat up a little straighter. "Mr. Calloway?" Calloway stiffened. "Your Honor," he began, clearing his throat. This could easily be an oversight, but Keanu wasn't finished. He rummaged through his file and pulled out something that would change everything. An affidavit. "This," Keanu said, his voice tight, "is from a former employee of Madsen's company, a man who was in the room when they decided to forge my contract." There was silence. The room went still. Keanu turned, scrutinizing the jury. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew I would never agree to sell. So they forged the papers, bribed the officials, and started building anyway, because they thought I wouldn't fight back. Calloway rose from his chair. "Objection. This is pure hearsay." Judge Bridger raised a hand. "Not if the witness testifies." "Mr. Reeves, do you intend to call this individual?" Keanu did not hesitate. "I do." The doors opened and the complainant entered the room. A man in his 40s, dressed in a plain suit, walked nervously toward the witness stand. His name was Daniel Pierce, a former project manager for Madsen's real estate empire. He drew in a shaky breath. "I didn't want to do this," he admitted, "but I can't keep quiet anymore." Calloway leaned forward. "Mr. Pierce, are you claiming under oath that my client knowingly violated property laws?" Pierce clenched his jaw. "Yes." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Judge Bridger turned to Calloway. "Mr. Calloway," the judge said, his voice cold, "do you have any answers?" Calloway adjusted his tie. He had nothing. For the first time that day, Gerald Madsen, who had remained seated in the courtroom, smugly observing the unfolding events, looked concerned. A great silence filled the room. No more whispers, no more smiles, no more sidelong glances at Keanu, as a fool for believing he could win. Everyone was motionless, eyes fixed on the test that had just played not once but twice. The recording hung in the air like a bomb. Gerald Madsen's voice, crystalline, damning, undeniable. "Relax, nobody's going to believe a nobody before us. We own this town. The papers are filed, the permits are done. By the time you realize what happened, it will be too late." A confession, captured, recorded. Madsen's empire, his carefully constructed web of deceit, bribery, and fraud, had just collapsed in real time before a packed courtroom. For the first time since the trial began, the arrogance disappeared from his face. Keanu saw it, the subtle, involuntary reactions of a man who had just realized that his kingdom was crumbling beneath his feet. The slight contraction of his jaw, the way he pressed his fingers against the armrest of the chair, the beads of sweat forming along his hair. Gerald Madsen, the untouchable, the indomitable, the real estate king of the city, was cornered, and he had nowhere to run. Across the room, Richard Calloway rose from his chair, his desperation now fully visible. His confident, calculating demeanor, it was gone. His suit, which had been spotless and perfect at the beginning of the trial, was now wrinkled, his tie slightly loosened, small signs of a man losing control. "Your Honor, this recording is totally out of context," he exclaimed, his voice strained, grasping at straws. "There is no evidence whatsoever that it refers to Mr. Reeves' land. It could be about any other deal, any other project." "Sit down, Mr. Calloway." Judge Wallace Bridger's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. Calloway closed his mouth. Slowly, stiffly, he sat back down, his face pale. For the first time, he knew the case was over. Judge Bridger turned his sharp gaze to Keanu. "Mr. Reeves, do you have anything else?" Keanu didn't hesitate. He reached into his folder one last time, his heartbeat steady. This was the final blow. A thick, yellow envelope. He held it up. The entire court watched in breathless silence. "Yes, Your Honor," Keanu said, his voice even, unwavering. "I have a bank slip, the evidence that broke him." Across the room, Madsen visibly stiffened, his back straightened too much and his eyes bored to Calloway, silently demanding an explanation. But there was none. Keanu approached the room and showed the document to everyone. "This," he said, pausing for effect, "is a direct bank transfer from Madsen's company to a government official a week before my land was legally transferred without my knowledge." A ripple went through the courtroom. Jurors leaned in, whispering among themselves. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. The audience gallery buzzed with energy. Keanu handed the document to the judge. Judge Bridger scanned it quickly and then paused. His jaw tensed. He lifted his eyes, now sharp and cold, and fixed them squarely on Madsen. "Mr. Madsen," he said slowly in a voice of a weight that sent a shiver through the room, "would you care to explain why your company paid a city official $500,000 just before this contract mysteriously appeared?" The silence that followed was stifling. Madsen opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked at Calloway, hoping for a lifeline, a strategy, a loophole, an escape. But Calloway was already picking up his briefcase. He was already the final nail in the coffin. The jury had seen enough. For months, they had laughed at Keanu. They had mocked him, dismissed him, treated him like a fool for daring to stand up to a man as powerful as Gerald Madsen. But now the judge was leaning forward with his full attention. Now the jury was no longer skeptical, it was angry. In the public gallery, there were murmurs, gasps, and the frantic whispering of reporters, eager to be the first to break the news. Madsen had lost. Calloway slumped in his seat, defeated. "No more questions," he muttered, his voice hollow. Judge Bridger nodded slowly and turned to the jury. "I think we've heard enough." A few jurors stared at Madsen as they stood and left the courtroom to deliberate. Keanu stood still, his hands gripping the table in front of him. He had done all he could. Now all he could do was wait. Minutes passed, then an hour, and finally the jury returned. The foreman, a middle-aged man with piercing eyes and a steely voice, stood up and cleared his throat. The entire courtroom held its breath. "In the case of Reeves versus Madsen Enterprises," he began, his voice echoing in the hushed courtroom, "we find in favor of the plaintiff. Justice served." The audience gallery erupted. Shouts, gasps, reporters rushing to their phones. Keanu closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of the moment sink in. He had won. Not just the case, not just the money, but the truth. Judge Bridger banged his gavel for order before speaking. "The court grants Mr. Reeves full ownership of his land, along with the damages paid by Madsen Enterprises." Then, after a pause, the judge turned his eyes cold, implacable to Madsen. "Further, continued Judge Bridger in a firm voice, this court will refer the evidence to the district attorney's office for further investigation of fraud and bribery." Madsen's face paled. Keanu watched as security guards approached the billionaire, who remained motionless. For the first time, Gerald Madsen was not in control. Justice had finally been served. Keanu took a slow breath. It was all over. As he left the courtroom, amid the reporters shouting his name and the stunned faces of those who doubted him, he had one certainty. They had underestimated the wrong man. The gavel struck the wood with a sharp, decisive crack. "Court is adjourned." Judge Wallace Bridger's voice echoed through the huge courtroom. But to Keanu it seemed distant, like a voice calling from underwater. For the first time in months, maybe even years, his fight was over. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just stood there, clutching the table, his fingers sinking into the worn grain of the wood. The world around him, once so noisy and chaotic, now seemed to have slowed down. The fall of Gerald Madsen. Across the room, Keanu could see Gerald Madsen, slumped in his chair, his once impeccable suit now looking too tight, too rumpled. His hair, always perfectly coiffed, was now disheveled, with a thin layer of sweat glistening on his forehead. For weeks, the billionaire real estate tycoon had entered this room as if it were his own, as if he were untouchable. But now he looked small. His once unshakable confidence, gone. His arrogance, crushed. His empire, stained by scandal. The security guards at the back of the room approached, not to arrest him, not yet, but to make sure that, when the time came, he did not flee. The jurors, who had previously listened, stone-faced to the endless legal gymnastics of his lawyers, were now giving him one last look of disgust. Journalists rushed to get their headlines out first. Phone screens glowed as breaking news flooded social media. And in the midst of it all, Keanu turned and looked Madsen in the eye. For the first time, he saw fear. Not the fear of losing money, not the fear of bad publicity, not even the fear of a lawsuit gone wrong. It was the fear of losing control. Madsen had spent his life buying influence, silencing his opponents, bending the law to his will, and yet here he was, powerless, exposed. The world had seen his true face, and there was nothing he could do about it. As soon as Keanu stepped out of the courtroom, a wall of flashing lights blinded him. Camera shutters clicked furiously, voices shouted over one another, and a sea of reporters rushed toward him with microphones held high, eager to catch his first words. "Mr. Reeves, what do you think of today's verdict? Do you think Gerald Madsen should be criminally charged? Was there ever a time when you doubted yourself?" The atmosphere was electric, a storm of excitement, disbelief, and eagerness for the next big headline. Keanu stood at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out at the swarm of reporters, wide-eyed with curiosity. I could see their expectations, waiting for him to deliver a speech, something grandiose, something triumphant. But Keanu didn't fight this battle for fame. He didn't fight for money. He fought because it was the right thing to do. And now, standing with his land restored, his name cleared, and the truth finally exposed, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. He took a slow breath before speaking. I did what anyone should do, he said in a firm voice. I stood up for myself. More questions were thrown at him, but Keanu didn't wait any longer. He tipped his hat slightly, turned and walked away. The cameras kept rolling. The world kept talking. But Keanu? He was already thinking about home. The courthouse was already a long way away. As Keanu drove down the long, winding dirt road, he finally felt he could breathe again. The setting sun cast a golden glow on the land that had almost been stolen from him, the land he had fought so hard to protect. And when he saw it, his land, his home, untouched and unstolen, it brought a lump to his throat. The place where his grandfather once stood, where his family built their legacy, was still his, because he never gave up, because he fought, because he refused to be silenced. He parked the truck near the old barn, got out, and his boots pounded the dry earth. For a long while, he stood there, taking it all in. The fields, the trees, the open sky. Madsen had tried to snatch it from him, but he had failed. Keanu made a promise to himself right there, never again. Because justice, it was never about money. It was about fighting when no one else would. It was about proving that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are never above the truth. They're never above the truth. The story of Keanu's victory spread like wildfire. People would remember this case as one of the greatest court battles of its time. A simple man with no legal training taking on a multi-millionaire and winning. They would talk about how Keanu refused to back down, refused to be intimidated, refused to give up. They would call him an inspiration, a fighter, a man who exposed corruption at the highest level. But Keanu, he didn't care about the headline. He didn't care about the people who once doubted him, now called him a hero. He only cared about one thing. The truth had been revealed, justice had been served, and no matter how many people had underestimated him, now they all knew they had picked the wrong man.